So some people insist that white privilege doesn't exist. I'm going to try to break this down real simple. I'm going to start with the story about Miss Jenkins, a woman who lived in South Carolina in the early 1900s. Miss Jenkins owned a significant amount of property, and obviously you have to pay property taxes. However, she felt very uncomfortable going into town to pay the property taxes because she would be discriminated against often. So, what she did was she entrusted her white neighbor to go pay these property taxes for her. Every month, she would give him the money for the property taxes. He would go into town, and instead of paying for the property tax, he would pocket it. He did this month after month after month until the bank finally foreclosed on her property. And then guess what he did? He used that money that she gave him to purchase the land himself. This land ended up being worth a lot of money. On the island alone that she owned, houses were selling for $400,000 a piece, and there were several houses on the island. So, Miss Jenkins ended up dying penniless. Not a single dollar to her name, all of her land stolen, and she died in a mobile home that belonged to her daughter. She wasn't allowed to pass this generational wealth on to her family. And that's kind of where the white privilege begins. It's this generational wealth that has not been allowed to be accrued by African Americans over the past century. White privilege isn't something like, oh, you're getting something extra, or being white makes your life easier. It has to do with what happened in the past that is now affecting the present. We all know slavery ended in 1865. Back then, African Americans were offered, you might have heard the term, 40 acres and a mule. What ended up being about 400,000 acres of land was given to African Americans. But guess what? As soon as Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president, he took all of that land back from African Americans. In 1910 is when African Americans had the most land that they've ever had, which was about 14% of the land in the United States. Now, they own 1% of the land. And guess what? White people own 96% of the land, which equates to about $1 trillion worth of land. And that 1% that African Americans own is about 14 billion. So, the privilege that exists was the privilege that white people were allowed to create generational wealth over the past 100 years. And it still exists because that generational wealth still exists, and the lack of generational wealth that black people don't have still exists. So until we can fix this issue, there's still going to be a disparity in the society. So that, in a nutshell, is what white privilege is.